Okay, everyone, we will begin the next panel, and it's a pleasure again to welcome you all here and to thank you for your interest in this important topic. This panel we will not videotape. This is our whistleblower panel, and as James Rogers in his very interesting remarks reminded us, many of us are former government and some current government who are listening and participating in this program. There can be consequences when people use their whistleblowing insights to raise issues about how the government works. And we have seen that phenomenon very much in the situation of the Afghan diaspora into the United States, particularly since 2021. So we're privileged today to have two panelists with me. One is who is a career diplomat, now retired. Left is an Afghan American who was, in fact, an authentic American ally in Afghanistan. He was an ally who helped there as an interpreter. He subsequently, before the collapse in 2021, has migrated to the United States and become an American citizen. He also has very interesting insights on what has been happening, particularly in recent years, as we deal with the phenomenon of more and more Afghan migration into the United States, which was, as touched upon by earlier speakers, very much part of the phenomenon of continued open border policies. It wasn't happening in a vacuum what was going on in Afghanistan. It had very much to do with Biden administration policies that were bringing literally millions of migrants into the United States. In this segment, I want to stress as well that when I was in government, and then I've continued on contact with people in government since the creation of the Ben Franklin Fellowship, particularly in the State Department, and many of my colleagues have passed along information, particularly on this program of Afghan migration. And it cuts across everything that we've been talking about so far this morning, and we'll continue later on vetting the questions of authentic identity and so forth. And particularly with Afghanistan, it seems to me some of the information that I've received clusters around obvious things, that the documentation about identity from a country like Afghanistan will always be fundamentally suspect, with widespread corruption across the different ethnic communities, et cetera. The unreliability of the authorities, it will always cast in doubt for anyone who has worked in visas or authenticating identity. You know what a challenge it is when the nationals come from a country in which the documentation is not reliable. That's very much present in everything that goes on with Afghanistan. It should be a significant factor for any policymakers who look forward with what we might do with Afghans coming to our country, the continued unreliability of identity information. And then we have, what we'll touch on in this segment is the machinery of the CARE program, which was, now that we've had several years to deal with this, quite clearly a fundamentally flawed process, particularly from the perspective of the United States, in that you want to know who is coming to the country and do they meet the criteria that we've set forth to bring them here. In the case of Afghans, largely SIVs, we've talked about that. What were their services in support of the American cause mission in Afghanistan? How was that verified? Were there any people there that kept that an honest relationship? Because when you screen an applicant to come to your country, it inevitably has to be somewhat of an adversarial process. What are your bona fides? Why are you coming? Prove your case. And if that doesn't exist, whether it's a border encounter from CBP in the United States or a State Department visa officer abroad, there is inevitably somewhat of a confrontational discussion there. If you remove that, this is what the whistleblowers have shown to us, that the CARE process was ultimately infiltrated by NGOs and others who had an interest in making sure that people were processed. That's why we hear back from people who worked inside CARE that they had to meet certain quotas, They had to find ways to process people. They inevitably became advocates for the people, the Afghans, that they were trying to bring into that were trying to screen to see if they qualified to come into the country. This created processes like Afghan evac, we touched on that earlier, having access to the space. These memos and so forth of understanding became essentially lobbying organizations. You had no one in this process, it's very clear from the CARE experience, who was challenging the bona fides of it. People showed up with counterfeit document. There were large numbers of Afghan heritage people who, because of language and other reasons, had to be frontline investigators, interpreters, and so forth in the process of assisting the American supervisors in CARE. What we've learned from the whistleblowers is all this process was ultimately corrupted very much, so that there were people admitted with fraudulent documents who had no business proving that they could not prove that they qualified in terms of having been an ally to the United States, et cetera, and so forth. The other component that's come out in this is the massive movement of children. Afghan children who were attached to people to come to the United States without their parents, so that the immigration process could be exploited and gamed, when these children would then process paperwork to bring their authentic parents to the United States. Now, we all know the massive problems that grew out of children coming across our southern border. And this was another variation of that same theme, children being put on planes, et cetera, to come to the United States to be the pathway to bring more family to our country. We were complicit, as cables that have been shared with whistleblowers have made clear. American authorities were overlooking these cases, bringing these children. This is highly vulnerable activity that leads to the trafficking and abuse of children. That was also interwoven in this process. We need to do a much better job in whatever context, but particularly with the Afghan children. And finally, the whistleblowers have brought out a huge phenomenon, which is that the idea of credible fear, which was the undergirding of all the Afghan, the entire process of people getting them away from the Taliban and others who would do them harm in the country. That framework has been totally overturned by the process that the Taliban have manipulated this in some cases, letting people come, letting people be processed. The Taliban have accepted that some people that we have given residency to in the United States are allowed to return to Afghanistan, travel back and forth. The idea that everybody who escaped the Taliban were like Jews escaping the Nazis is totally not in touch with reality. There is a process by which the Taliban, imagine this, are also gaming the people that they allowed to come to the United States, or people in our country of Afghan heritage going back and forth. We are creating another relationship with a foreign power that's hostile to us, in which their nationals are here. And when you interweave some of the cultural differences that we've talked about, the policy differences and so forth, how is it in the American national interest, which should be the very first standard to bring people to our country in which we cannot verify them and who in fact may be in cahoots with the Taliban. So all of this information, we're going to turn to Leaksme here in a second to get some of her insights, but all of this information in different ways has come to us, and others as well, from whistleblowers, people, consular officers who were appalled that this was happening, et cetera. And without an effort like this to bring this information forward, to talk to our friends in Congress, to staff, that you cannot manage this situation with all these factors in a way that was created after 2021. It needs to be fundamentally changed, and it needs to take on board all of this discrediting information so that we don't do these stupid things again in the future. So why don't you give us your insights?
I'm honored to be here today to speak on behalf of my State Department colleagues who are whistleblowers. These brave men and women have put our country's national security first and foremost, at a great risk to their careers and to their personal lives. I have three whistleblower narratives I'd like to share with you. And the first one comes from a law enforcement colleague, and it concerns the Afghan special immigrant visa and the unit within the State Department that processes the SIVs. The Afghan Special Immigrant Visa Unit, known as ASIV, was set up in our South Central Asia Bureau to perform the function of the Chief of Mission Committee at post. However, in practice, the ASIV unit eliminated the checks and balances in the approval process. They insisted that ASIV vetting was a document-based process, meaning review of the letters of recommendation, letters of employment was the vetting process itself. Interviews by consular officers and border inspectors were pro forma. If the ASIV unit said the documents were verified, they expected consular officers and CBP to approve and would try to intervene if approval was not automatic. The ASIV unit maintains a spreadsheet from diplomatic security of over 1,000 known or suspected authors of fraudulent letters and fictitious companies. However, using a letter from someone on the list may or may not have been flagged for fraud interviews. Even when the applicants were refused, they would get a soft 221G or pending more documents refusal and be allowed to reapply with a different employer and or letter. Verification of the letters authenticity consisted of a single email sent to the email address supplied by the letter writer, which often could be monitored by an Afghan who worked for the ASIV unit. ASIV unit leadership's motivation was to approve as many Afghans as possible, to clear out the lily pads, and not to safeguard the homeland. ASIV unit shielded their three-letter agency contacts from inquiry or scrutiny of their applicants. They became combative when diplomatic security investigators with diplomatic security investigators, while insisting that we collaborate. The next testimonial is from a consular officer. I was in the immigrant visa section of a post where several Afghan SIVs sought interviews in 2022 and 2023. We were not provided any specialized training on how to properly screen or adjudicate these visas, and there was no centralized team that we could ask for assistance. There was some remote support for document analysis, but it's easy to obtain real documents in Afghanistan through bribery, that this would not have deterred any fraudulent applicants. We received a short, several-page SOP on how to process Afghan SIVs that was largely focused on how to process them within the system rather than how to ensure that these were bona fide applicants. The consensus seemed to be that if an applicant had received Chief of Mission approval, they were qualified absent any derogatory information that may have already been entered into the system. There was also one homegrown database that we were given access to that stored the documents submitted by the SIV applicants as part of the COM approval process. This was not a very professional system that had no ability to communicate with other systems, cross-check data, or perform fraud prevention activities at the case level. A good example of how the system was flawed can be seen in the case of Dilbar Gul Taj Ali Khan, which I think was mentioned earlier. We received requests for interviews from several applicants that had been denied visas in Kabul for fraud. In one case, we received an email from an applicant who had received COM approval despite receiving an SIV letter from the disgraced U.S. naval officer, Jeremy Pittman. We only caught this issue because I dug into the Enterprise Case Assessment System, ECAS, a separate consular tool, and found case notes left by the Fraud Prevention Unit at Embassy Kabul just before the withdrawal. Had I not done so, we might have issued this applicant a visa. In another separate instance, the Coordinator for Afghan Relocation Efforts Office, CARE Office, asked our political econ section in an email to submit a P1 referral for refugee resettlement into the United States for an Afghan man whose family had been evacuated to the U.S. on the strength of a pending SIV application. Upon learning that this man's COM approval was denied for having submitted falsified documents in a previous SIV application, meaning that he was permanently ineligible to receive a visa to the United States, the CARE official stated that this was, quote, sad that he is separated from his family, rather than being rightfully upset that the U.S. government paid to evacuate this fraudulent applicant's entire family. My third and last testimonial. I remember when the Afghan evacuees first came to the U.S. in 2021. I heard they were being brought to Fort Lee for processing. I immediately wanted to help because I came here as a refugee myself. America has truly been a land of opportunity for me and my family. I was given a great education and eventually began a career at the State Department. So at the time, I felt I could relate to the Afghan refugees along with the Ukrainian refugees. After working at Fort Lee and the Dulles Task Force, I volunteered in other ways, all on my own personal time, of course. I helped deliver Thanksgiving meals to the homes of newly arrived Afghans that year. Gradually, my family and I even became friends with several Afghan families. We gave them clothes, helped them find jobs, and even housing. So it was surprising when one of the Afghans first mentioned that he might go back to Afghanistan for a visit and to attend a wedding. As a former refugee, I knew a key criterion to be a refugee is a well-founded fear of persecution. Had my family members or I tried to return to our native country, we would have been killed within hours. I think deep down, I realized many of the Afghans that we helped who came to the U.S. under the Biden administration between 2021 and 2024 were not Afghan allies and were not even actual refugees. Months later, another Afghan woman told me something else that disturbed me. She told me a family member who had health insurance from her employer had also made Medicaid claims, which of course is for low-income people. I couldn't believe it that this family, after being welcomed by America, would choose to abuse that generosity by committing Medicaid fraud, cheating the U.S. government. I reported it to the authorities and stopped contact with that family. I later heard that she had to pay back the $15,000 in fraudulent Medicaid claims, but also that she was hired to be a case manager for the Coordinator for Afghan Relocation Efforts office. While I reported her to the CARE leadership and to the contractor, they continued to employ this Afghan woman who cheated the U.S. government of $15,000. They continued to employ her for 2 years. Meanwhile, as I continued my work at the State Department and began to learn more about the CARE office, I began to notice some odd things. CARE had 300 plus contractor staff, and many of them were Afghan nationals. To work on such a complex U.S. government process, you would expect these would be the most English literate Afghans and probably the ones who had worked for the U.S. government. Yet I noticed many of them barely spoke English. Some literally could not write a single email. Importantly, none had a security clearance, just a background check, which limited what they could work on. Then I started noticing employed in the CARE office were multiple members of the same Afghan families. They were making sure that when an opening came up, their family members got the job. And if that wasn't enough, I found out that the woman who committed Medicaid fraud was taking bribes to bring in other Afghans. So the CARE office had essentially been taken over by completely unqualified and corrupt Afghan nationals who had begun to rig the hiring system to make sure their family members were hired, freezing out the qualified Afghans who had worked for the U.S. government in Afghanistan. I firmly believe that Great Hills Solutions, the contractor employing the 300 plus Afghan nationals, was aware of what was happening. As bad as all that is, I reported all my concerns to the CARE office leadership. I had every expectation that they would take my concerns seriously. What did they do? They contacted my supervisor. They accused me of having some personal bias or financial motivation. They completely failed to look into the things I have reported. For a program that cost the American people over $12 billion in 4 years, I was horrified that there was no oversight or accountability. Soteria Solutions Solace, the contractor responsible for CARE logistics, received $1 billion. Great Hill Solutions, the contractor for personnel related to the CARE office received $900 million. It costs American taxpayers $1.4 million a day for CARE to run the refugee camp, Camp Al Salia in Doha, which housed up to 4,000 Afghans. It now costs $1 million a day to house 1,100 Afghans in Doha. The cost to bring in Afghan evacuees was exorbitantly high, but the cost to our national security is even higher. The whistleblowers in the State Department can attest that the rampant fraud and corruption of the CARE office allowed in Afghans who were neither Afghan allies nor real refugees. It's estimated by whistleblowers that more than half of the Afghans who were allowed into the U.S. under a special immigrant visa program and the U.S. refugee admissions program have either terrorist ties or criminal ties or came in with fraudulent documents.
We will turn now to get his thoughts, and then we'll go and get some questions and more interaction with the audience. You have the floor.
All right, good morning, everyone. I'm referred to called. So I am thrilled to be here today in front of all you great folks and meeting all of you guys here in Washington, D.C. Very few of you probably know about my articles that I have been sent to John, and probably a little knowledge about me. Allow me to introduce and make a very short introduction about myself. I was born in Afghanistan. I was born and raised in Afghanistan, and served with the most most elite warrior and other coalition forces in Afghanistan. While helping interrogate and suspected Taliban terrorists, I acquired certain knowledge and experience that I wish to share with both my fellow Americans and our government in the hope of protecting our beloved nation. I have observed and documented credible deduction that the previous administration had released potential Taliban terrorists and supporters onto American soil, with no way to track their whereabouts, intention, and activities. Until the Taliban situation is addressed at the highest level of our government and corrective measures are implemented, we are placing our lives, ourselves, in a grave risk. The risk is dramatically increased with one odds that threats across American southern border posed by the unending flow of foreign nationals, 20% of whom are got-away people who are entered without detection and then burrow into our society. So I'm gonna talk about my work record. So if anybody's interested, they can obtain the documents from the Department of Defense that I have been worked with them from 2010 until February 2021. My first deployment was from 2010 to 2013 in Bagram Airfield. I was working at the Camp Sabalu Harrison, the Power One detention facility. And the second deployment that it's from 2013 to 2014, I was working with third Group Special Forces in Jalalabad and Pachirwagam district of Jalalabad. It was very close to Tora Bora Mountain. From 2014 to 2015, with third Group Special Forces, I was working. It was in Charikar province. From 2017 to 2019, I came back from 2014. I came home, stayed home for a couple of years, and then I went back. So from 2017 to 2019, I was working as as interpreter as a counterintelligence team in Bagram Airfield, participating, over 1,500 interrogation I did, and PCAS, Parliamentary Credibility Assessment Screening system, and interviews with bio-enrollment of investigation into Afghan national interrogation of Afghan National Army officers, generals, soldiers, and locals in many provinces of Afghanistan. From 2020 to 2021, I worked with Australian Defence Forces on assignment at Hamid Karzai International Airport, HKIA, with coalition forces developing Kabul security plans, providing assistance to Kabul Garrison Command, KGC, which was later dissolved and replaced by KGC, Kabul Joint Command. I became a translator with the Department of Defense to help to screen Afghan evacuees in 2021, September 2021 until February 2022. In August 2021, I accepted the contract consulting position with the Department of Defense to help screen Afghan evacuees. At U.S. military base, I performed this work from September 2020 through February 2022, which gave me an up-close and personal opportunity to see, talk, and help evaluate some of the tens of thousands of Afghans who were able to board the last-minute flights out of Afghanistan and ended up at the U.S. military bases in the United States. Why we need to call Afghan who arrived at U.S. military bases evacuees, not a refugee. There's no question that some, if not many, of the Afghans who are allowed to board on U.S. military transporters and America's haphazards, rash withdrawals from Afghanistan are ended refugees. This term means civilians who are fleeing the conflict or like the prosecutions. The simple fact, however, is that there are little no screening done of the people who boarded those planes, meaning we have no idea who they are, their background, or if they are terrorists or not. This is why I urge us to view the tens of thousands of Afghans who made into the U.S. soil to be referred as evacuees until we have a reasonable basis on which we believe they means no harm. So my experience and observation at Fort McCoy, I felt that the day that they picked me up from the airport and dropped me off at the base, it was in the middle of the night. I didn't see anything. And the next morning, when I just walked outside, I felt like I have walked into a village full of the Taliban. Their ideologies and supporters. It was crazy when I saw all those people. The way they dressed, their style and their looks was horrifying to me because, once you have the experience going to those countries, you see the same kind of people there, and then you come back here, you see the same people here. It's like a PTSD, Yeah, it was like bringing me back the whole memories that, okay, for a moment I completely, I forgot that I'm here in the U.S. The same dressing, I have provided some pictures, the same exact, outfit appearance. I think for John, I think he posted somewhere. Many, if not most of the evacuees I spoke to are, by their own admission, they came to the United States. They're not at risk of the Taliban. Their life was not at risk. I know this because I have talked to some of them, and their answer was crazy. Their response was with laughter, and they mentioned something along the line. It was just a free trip for us. The airport was wide open. The plane was, right on the, on the tarmac. Everybody was jumping in, and we did the same. And now we're here in the U.S. Free trip. Most of them were barbershops, street vendors, truck drivers. They left their truck in front of the airport, and they just jumped on the plane and came here. That's what I heard, and I talked to so many of them, and they say the same thing. The main issue I have, the Department of Homeland Security and DHS and other relevant agencies, they keep emphasizing that their words, this is their words, not mine. The evacuees, they are free to leave whenever they want and wherever they go, anytime they want. That was exactly what they were saying, without any checking, like background checks and stuff, without concluding their process. These authorities were telling evacuees that if they leave before the complete screening procedure are completed, The only things they will lose is the cash. And that's the support benefits they are eligible for from the State Departments and various NGOs, some of which are funded with American taxpayers. Other than that, evacuees were told that they are welcome to leave. The DHS would be dropping them off the Fort McCoy's main gate, where they were free to walk into American soil without completing their procedure. A lot of families, and most concerned to me, single military-aged males, have already left Fort McCoy's. To me, this means that DHS and other relevant agencies were unleashing the most terrifying individuals onto American soil. These people with unknown backgrounds and intent, and in doing so, are putting a lot of innocent American lives at risk. As we witnessed in Washington, D.C., which caused the life of 2 American service members. Because of the irresponsible operation protocol established by the federal government and implemented during the Biden administration, I believe it is my obligation as a patriotic U.S. citizen to speak out. To those in position of influence and authority can take corrective action to protect the American people. The correct action that must be taken and my willings to help. I think the information obtained in this article is vital for the American people and our government to understand and investigate to help protect ourselves from the threats of Taliban terrorism being unleashed onto American soil. Thank you.
Okay. Why don't we, very provocative words and very helpful for all of us to understand some of the dynamics here and this massive confusion of this diaspora. We'll do some questions.
I was wondering, when you're interviewing these Afghans that you were interviewing, could they believe that we were letting them in? In other words, was it sort of, it reminds me of a scene, sorry to trivialize it, but there's a movie called Coming to America. Mm-hmm. There's it's about a Russian who defects. It's a long story, but he tells his lawyer tells the story of he was a Cuban and he washed ashore in Florida, and he's staggering, and then an American tourist there thinks he's a waiter and hands him $20 to go get him a drink, and he thinks that this is incredible. He comes to America and they're giving him money on the beach. Anyway, was there any sort of incredulity among the Afghans that you interviewed that the Americans would actually allow this sort of thing?
Actually, they didn't believe, most of them, that they are here already in America, because it was just the last minute, just jumping on the plane and came here, and they were not believing that they are going to America. So once they got here and they were like, oh, are we dreaming? Are we really here? That was the problem. Most of those people, they had no idea. So they're here now. Right. Yeah.
Just as one follow-up, did you get any sense that they had any idea of what to expect in America? In other words, was it totally unrealistic? That kind of thing?
That was that's the problem was, most of them, they have been told, I don't know what kind of information they have, they were getting. So they were expecting that once you get to America, everything is free. Right. Yeah. They're going to give you a house, they're going to give you a car, every month, probably $2,000, $3,000. That's what exactly they're expecting. But, most of them were not happy to stay on the base for at least, to complete their process. They were like, okay, I'm going to leave. Why they're keeping us here? I got into a heated argument with one of those guys, you're here for free. You didn't spend a single penny to be here in America. You get, hot meals 3 times a day. Everything, hot shower, everything is, provided to you. So you're very ungrateful. And they were like, and then some of them were not understanding, but some of them were like, no, we should be out of here. And they brought us here. They have to give us everything.
I'm interested in, the current government's role in this. Are there any push factors that we should be, aware of? Because it seems to me that maybe the Taliban would like the relatively more Western people from Afghanistan to leave. It would benefit them in terms of regime resilience, and they wouldn't want like terrorists in the news like attacking, people in the U.S. It doesn't reflect well on them, and I assume they would want to prioritize, some relative stability. So is there like any indications of like the Taliban like pushing for this, or any signs that they would want to stop? I don't know, help the U.S.
I'm not sure, what's the measure for that one. So, what's the government is doing it right now. So the only thing is just the way I think if the Taliban is, like in contact with their individuals here, they are. So the problem is, the government should take a very, corrective measures, to go toward that, do the reprocess and, all those, to review their cases. I don't know exactly if they're doing it right now, but, like I'm not in the...
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting point, the question about a foreign power, a hostile foreign power, more or less, having a population group in the United States, right? I mean, we've seen that with more typically countries in the Western Hemisphere who have a large population group living in the United States. It's a source of money, source of interaction, and so forth. In many ways, it can be profitable for a government. Now, how sophisticated the Taliban is on this would have to defer to more expertise than I have. But I would expect, your question, if I understood it correctly, is it somewhat counterproductive for the Taliban when they realize that people here might be doing terrorist strikes for having some kind of relationship down the road with us? Yeah, probably some of them are thinking about that. But the other side of this, very tribal community, ethnic community, if money's coming back, flowing back from these communities in the United States back to Afghanistan, is also probably a very positive relationship. How they balance all that, maybe we'll get some more insights on that question from other experts. Yeah.
I would add that I strongly urge CBP to investigate all the Afghan who returned to Afghanistan, who paid for their own trips back to Afghanistan. We don't know their motives, and I strongly urge CBP to review these Afghans, some of whom worked for the State Department as contractors in the Coordinator for Afghan Relocation Efforts, the CARE office. They even reported their travel to their supervisors, to the CARE leadership team, and were never questioned. If these were true refugees, I don't think that within 3 to 4 years they would have returned to the country where they claimed a fear of persecution. And so we still don't know their motives. I think that the Taliban certainly welcomed them back because they were able to return to the U.S. And even now, I think the Afghans who are in Camp Al-Saliyah in Doha, many of them Pashtun families, have accepted $4,200 per person, I think, to return to Afghanistan. What we hear is that none of them have faced persecution, retribution from the Taliban. So I think that tells a story in and of itself.
Just a quick question. Talking to them, do you feel they had like anti-American sentiments, or do they like Americans?
Some of them,
Not
like,
living in America, but just Americans, Did they say, well, we don't like you, and
just an example, I got into an argument with 3 individuals on the distribution center, like where they were getting their clothes and stuff, because they were waiting in line for too long, and they were arguing, we hate America. They're infidels, we get whatever we want, like this kind of stuff. They were like, I said, like, why you guys are here? Why you're not going back if you hate America? It's like, oh, because we're at risk. I said, like, you're not at risk. If you were at risk, you would not talking like this. So those kind of, there are some people, they were, once you were talking about them, like talking to them about the Taliban and stuff, they were like very, very defensive. they were, very defensive, and they were defending the group, and, like, oh, they're not that bad and stuff. So that tells us a story too. So
Did some have family, friends here already, so they had plans to go? And
some of them had, but not all of them. But there were some of them, like, that was their first time, traveling on a plane. So they just picked up from somewhere, dropped them off at the airport. That's it. They're here the next day.
And I can add to that, having volunteered to help many Afghan families, the ones who claimed they worked for the U.S. Embassy, I was very surprised to hear the animosity towards America and Americans, claiming that the U.S. owed them because we had destroyed their country. And that's why I think many of the Afghans resettled in the DMV area felt that they could have jobs and then claim Medicaid and public assistance, which they were not allowed to do because it's double dipping. But they told me that there was no reason why they shouldn't get every entitlement that was owed them. And these were the ones who supposedly worked for the U.S. Embassy. So I can't imagine what other Afghans who didn't work for the U.S. government felt.
I know you were busy during the time that you were in Afghanistan, but the Special Inspector General for Afghan Reconstruction, John Sopko, would regularly issue reports talking about the massive levels of fraud in Afghanistan.
Yeah.
During the American presence there, let's say. Did you see any of that fraud? Was it really as widespread? Because he estimated that there could have been up to $1 trillion in fraud in Afghanistan.
In Afghanistan, yes, there was like it was widespread. It wasn't like one or two. It was like everybody. It was involved in the fraud. Like even from the lowest level all the way to highest level. So the money that has been like went to Afghanistan, I think like it was the way you say like trillions of dollars. Nothing happened. Everything was gone. Like the next day, everybody was like, taking their parts, just leaving. So that was the way that, I was working with the special forces. One of the captain, he told me like, it was about $30 million a day for all the American bases in Afghanistan. They're spending like $30 to $35 million a day they're spending. And, like the way that they're helping the Afghan government, they were not getting anywhere. That's what they were kept saying, everyone.
Just another quick follow-up question about the folks here.
Mm-hmm.
Are we doing anything to assimilate those folks to American culture at the safe havens?
It's really hard, like they adopt the culture because it's still, I live in San Diego, California. I witness every day the way they dress up exactly the same that they came here the first day. And the way that long hair, dressing up like Afghan, they're putting out Afghan outfit and they're just, they gather in some places in the parking lot and, like 15, 20 of them and just, disturbing other people the same way like they do it. If somebody is telling them, they're just, getting off and, like getting mad and start yelling at you.
And I can add that the community here in the DC area, the ones who have assimilated, they distance themselves from the majority of Afghans who don't assimilate. There were programs at the different DoD bases on cultural orientation, on obeying U.S. laws. So there certainly was an attempt to try to assimilate them and to educate the Afghan evacuees on American customs and regulations. And I found that while certainly there are some good Afghan families who did their best to assimilate, to start a new life here in the U.S., many were rather reluctant.
I think you've all described a vetting failure pretty well, but I heard in the NCTC Director Kent's testimony before Congress saying that a lot of these folks that came over on SIVs, for example, were battlefield vetted. They weren't vetted for entry to the United States. And I could certainly list a handful of folks that have become very violent since they arrived who theoretically were vetted. So I wanted to ask, how much pressure is on the folks that were interpreters before, or in the case of Mr. Tahedi or the Mr. Lakwala, the actual former employees, that there was no fraud there as far as we know. But how much of this is a radicalization after they arrive based on pressure, or what is the cause, I guess?
I exactly don't know. Probably the way they describe it is probably like like mentally issues and stuff. But I don't think so. It's not because there's a lot of people. It's they just influenced by some religious folks and stuff, and still they're following up the same probably mentality that they came here in America, and they just the same mentality that they if they kill infidels and stuff, and they they getting something. So that's what the problem is right here. I witnessed myself, a lot of radicals, and they're not changing at all. So, talking to those people is hard. They're not accepting your ideas. They're not accepting what you're saying. But the way they describe themselves, and it's like crazy. Yeah. Based on the SIV, I can say not all of them are there's a lot of them that after the evacuation there's a lot of fraud. I think the recommendation later was issued by some of the generals or whoever was in charge of those the teams and stuff, but they were buying those. The SIV, the recommendation later. The recommendation, I think if I'm not mistaken, some people, the information I got, it was like $10,000 per recommendation later. They were selling. So I know some people in San Diego, they came here through that one. They have no, skills of speaking English, and they have very basic knowledge, education and stuff. So they bought the SIV visa and just got here.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, just all this stuff is incredibly familiar to me, having been there for a year. I would just sort of step back, and I blame the United States. This is our fault. It's not. Human nature is immutable for the last 20,000 years. People will, if there's a way to get something, we'll do it. All human beings are the same. So we're opening the door to anybody. The other thing I would just say, as a part-time consular officer, having interviewed 30,000 people in my life, a lot of them sort of refugees coming back and follow to join. I'll say this statement. I actually never met a real refugee in my entire life. I never did, because if you take, and I'm not an attorney, I'm not an expert, but I think we used the 1951 convention, which is like a fear of persecution. They all go back to their home country on vacation, and the Boston Marathon bombers, they were going back to the Caucasus. I mean, there's supposed to be fear of, it's absurd. But again, I really blame our government. We're biting off way more than we can chew. A lot of us is good-hearted people who really believe in helping people. God bless some of our compatriots, but I just don't think they're accustomed to the real world. This is just my opinion. I could be wrong. The other thing I would just say is the elite Afghans, they're all American citizens, and their kids, they get a visa for training. They bring their family, they stay there, and they come back. We ran into that a lot. They have their babies in the States. All over the world, the elite has their babies in the States. I spent time in Nigeria. I never met sort of an elite Nigerian who did not have all their children are American citizens, which, that's legal. The other thing I would just say, one of these days, maybe, or today, maybe we can talk about the weapons and the planes that we left behind. That's a separate issue, but I don't read much about that in the press. The other thing is having the allegation that we destroyed Afghanistan. What about the Soviet Union? They completely destroyed it when they were leaving. I'm just ticking off a few
But Ian, do you have a question? We'll wrap up.
The people that you spoke to that were contemptuous of America, that kind of came here on the spur of the moment, as you said. They just got on a plane here. Did they talk with you about their plan to bring over their families? Or
Oh,
what
yes.
was their future plan? Were they going to go back, or did they want all their family to come over and live here in this country that they don't really respect, but they want all the free benefits?
That's one thing, you know, like all of them want to bring their families, all of them, no matter what, you know. That's why they, I think some of them, they brought their, you know, their brother's children or their one of their relatives' children. So here, to, you know, those cases, you know, like those children can bring their parents or their brothers or whoever. That's what happened. I know one guy, he brought his little brother, but he was, I think the case was for him, you know, like he was a single parent. That guy, his brother was little brother, but he was a single parent. He was getting all the benefits because of that little kid. And later on, you know, like for an American citizen or probably for an American green card holders, it's going to take a long time to process their you know, their families to bring here. Probably 5 years, 6 years. But those people, in a matter of 1 year, that kid brought 7 members of his family here. That's the problem here. You know, like pushing back all those, you know, legal immigrants who are here, who have been, you know, living here for their whole life, but, you know, giving the opportunity for those little ones, you know, like they just got here, they bring their whole family members. So that's what the problem is right here.
To Ian's point, I want to say there are real refugees. I myself am a real refugee. No, I completely understand, but a real refugee, like me and my family, who escaped from a genocide in Cambodia, we come here and we do not return to Cambodia. I was actually only sent to Cambodia when I started working for the State Department. So the fact that Afghans who come here and then return to Afghanistan which is still under the same Taliban that took over in 2021, I do think that they are not refugees. They do not face persecution. And there are Afghans who came here who have a well-founded fear of persecution. But unfortunately, the majority are not refugees.